Welcome to Business 7, the program where we look a little bit more in depth at the current financial and economic issues of the day. Now, in this program, we're going to have a conversation with Chantell Husselmann. She is a tax partner and expert at PwC Namibia, and that's all about the upcoming budget, which we expect next week. And Chantell will share with us especially her thoughts and expectations around tax. Then also in the studio later we have Bruce Hansen, the Managing Director of Simonis Storm. Of course, analysts closely looking at the impact of the economy in general, but also the COVID-19 pandemic on the motor industry, and specifically around what the outlook for new vehicle sales is. Also in our issue today, of course, it is in Republikein, Allgemeine Zeitung and the Namibian Sun, and you can read it online and on our Facebook platforms. We're looking at the issue of whether basic income can protect people in a crisis, and then a very interesting in-depth article around gaping holes in what experts say one can see in Africa's health system. That is specifically pertaining to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have a very interesting infographic in there where you can see how Namibia measures up to other countries in Africa. We're talking about the budget, and a budget in or under very, very difficult circumstances. Joining me in the studio is Chantell Husselmann. She is a tax partner at PwC Namibia. Welcome, Chantell, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jo Marie.
Chantell, an interesting budget from various perspectives. It will be the maiden budget by our new Minister of Finance, Shimi, so one would like to get an indication of the way he thinks, but also, unlike ever before, it will be a budget that needs to address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. From your experience so far, how badly has the economy been hit by this pandemic?
If we look at the past 3 financial years, Jo Marie, we are all aware that we've been in a mild recession, and we're still on a path of making do with what we have and also curbing the existing deficit levels, as well as our exposure to debt levels. So, but along came the pandemic. And yes, our new minister now had a small time frame or window of opportunity with the extension of tabling our national budget to just rebalance the budget and to work in, for example, the impact of the announced stimulus package to the economy, to businesses and to households. Because a lot of the medium-term projections made, including this current financial year, will definitely have to be relooked from a pandemic perspective. So that means it speaks to how did we project revenue growth as well as expenditure curbing or growth, and the impact on our budgeted deficit levels. So it's a total new conversation, and in order to be relevant and transparent in that process, it was indeed a good decision. We regard it as a good decision to move the tabling of the budget and to have a relevant approach.
Yes, an absolutely new ball game, not just for Namibia, but for the world. Chantell, your area of expertise is tax. What do you expect in the budget from, say, a tax proposal perspective?
On the positive side, we do not foresee with the current outlook that there will be announcements on increased rates of taxes, whether that is from an individual or from a company perspective. But we are cognizant of the pressure that government faces on attaining targeted revenue collections for this year. So there's pressure on collecting tax revenue, and from that perspective, we also now do not foresee announced decreases, perhaps on the household side, but definitely not from a value-added tax or corporate tax perspective.
And in previous fiscal years or budget speeches, there has been numerous announcements regarding tax amendments. What do you expect might be in this budget as far as amendments are concerned?
That is a huge challenge to the new Minister, Jo-Marie, because all the previous announcements, which I will now quickly run through, but all of them were focused on widening the tax net and deepening the net and generating more tax revenue. For example, there was a lot of talks, and we expected to come through an introduction of a tax on dividends by local residents as well, not just the foreigners, which we already have. There was an introduction to tax the commercial activity of charitable organizations. For example, churches were under the spotlight. Then there was a proposal to tax trusts differently, and even on the value-added tax side, impacting households a lot was the talks of not zero rating the sale of sugar, for example, and from a business perspective on VAT to start taxing asset managers, the management fee which they earn, which will directly impact again the returns on investments. So all of that was from a drive of increasing tax revenue, and obviously that would have impacted households and business entities a lot. So the current conversation is to what extent can there be a balance between safeguarding the tax revenue, but also looking after the impact on the economy from a commercial perspective and from households also from a standard of living perspective, because for now we have households that are subject to reduced levels of income and a lot of pressure in that space.
Yes, and also your unemployment figure that people expect will increase substantially. Tax, of course, equals revenue, and as we've pointed out, it's going to be a very fine balancing act between revenue and how much government can spend to stimulate the economy. Overall, just in a nutshell, what are your expectations on revenue and, for instance, also the impact on SACU?
Yeah. We do expect that there will be a drop in forecasted revenue. That is because all the various taxes through which government collects tax, that's whether it's the SACU pool, whether it's through employee taxes, corporate tax, as well as value-added tax, through different daily activities, individuals transacting with businesses or business-to-business transactions, local and cross-border. All of those, the landscape change, it's pandemic impacted. We foresee lesser trade globally, and especially with our regional trade partners like South Africa, the SACU trade partners as well. We expect an increase in unemployment rates impacting pay-as-you-earn revenue. We expect a drop in household disposable income, which impacts VAT collections again. So it's not a positive outlook, and there's huge pressure on the government on attaining much needed tax revenue targets to finance the budget from that perspective. So we do foresee a stretch in terms of deficit levels and perhaps increased borrowing in that regard.
And in terms of spending, where do you expect government might cut and where might it stimulate?
We expect that the stimulating will continue with a focus on the social sectors, for example, which is also depicted a lot in the economic stimulus package as announced. So that from a ministerial allocation perspective, big allocations would be made to health and social services as well as education. And then the question on where to cut, it's a good one, Jo-Marie, and that is where it is so crucial and important to make sure that we have effective and productive spending within the budget that we will be granted. Because what now makes to be weighed for is also the impact of this 8.1 billion stimulus impact.
Which we didn't have
Which
last year.
it was not
forecast,
foreseen,
yeah.
we didn't forecast for it, and it is, as we speak, it's being spent. Even before the budget is tabled, under the relevant provisions of the State Finance Act, obviously. So, but it's all realities that needs to be taken into account. We are aware of the pressure on the wage bill, the state wage bill, but that also directly speaks again to our expectation of having higher unemployment rates, just from a private sector employment perspective. So it is not a positive outlook, and it is definitely a time for us as a nation to pull together and to make sure that in all our activities the decisions are made that's best for the country.
Indeed, a watershed budget that we are expecting. Chantell, thank you very much, and we will most certainly have you back in the studio to dissect the budget once it has been tabled.
Thanks for having me. Thank you to our viewers.
That the new vehicle sale industry has been having an uphill battle for quite some time is no secret, and the new vehicle sales figures for April shouldn't have been a surprise given the lockdown. However, it was still frightening to actually see it black on white. In the studio to discuss the industry with me is Bruce Hansen. He's the Managing Director of Simonis Storm. Hello Bruce, welcome and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jo Marie. Good to be here.
In a nutshell, why has the industry been having such a tough time? We've seen it now over the past 2-3 years that there's been a gradual decline. What contributed to that?
I think maybe just to give a bit of background on that, Jo Marie, what we've seen over the last, since independence really, is there was this wealth effect that we've seen in Namibia, and people got wealthy very quickly. And what has happened was they have spent their money on some of these, luxury goods.
Yes.
So it would be white goods, and it would be things like motor cars, for instance. And so what we've seen is that, that was a sort of an upswing for a very long period. And when we got to a point where suddenly economic growth was not what we've expected it to be or what it was before, people started to taper down on that. And you've seen over the last 2 years, you've seen that the vehicle sales numbers have dropped off from the highs that they were. So if one would take April's figures and you look and you consider it before COVID, we've already seen that there was a downward trend. And we've also seen it in installment credit, for instance. So people have just bought fewer and fewer vehicles. Now with COVID was a different aspect, because suddenly what you had is that there was no access for buyers to go to the showroom and actually have a look at the cars and decide to buy those cars. So I think to a large degree was the access that you had to those showrooms, but I think one should not minimize or discount the effect that we've already seen a downward curve in motor vehicle sales, new motor vehicle sales.
Yes, obviously also because of the level of indebtedness of the consumer, as you've mentioned. For a while there was a shopping spree going on non-productive items, then the bonds stepping in, trying to curb the installment sales with the period that you could repay was shortened, etc., etc. And then of course government, which started consolidating and cutting back massively on spending, like for instance vehicles. That also played a role.
It definitely played a role. I think one would have to then consider that government is a huge player in our economy, and if government slows down or stops, that definitely hurts the economy. And I think if you look at if you look at GDP as a measure of economic growth, so the formula would be GDP equals consumption plus investments, government spending, and then exports minus imports. Now that consumption area, that's where motor vehicle sales will fall in. And government spending on the other side, if government does not spend, you will have an effect on that consumer part of it. And you're right, because we've also seen government needed to put in austerity measures, and some of those things were motor vehicle sales, because these are the things that you can easily cut and then get a benefit out of that. So yes, rightly so. But it was not just government. I think it was business, plus it was the consumer.
Exactly.
So this was a total effect. One may be more than the other, but generally
yes,
there was a slowdown.
It was a complete slowdown. Of course, the April figures, one can't really, I mean, it's happened, we knew it was going to happen, it was still shocking to see it. But what is important now is the outlook.
Yeah.
What are the chances, and I know these predictions are virtually impossible to make, but to which extent can new vehicle sales pick up for the rest of the year in the current economy?
Mm-hmm. Now, a couple of factors. The one would be that we have now opened up, or at least we've the restrictions are not as strict as it used to be, so people can now move around and they can probably now have access to the showrooms. There might be people that have planned to buy, and they might go ahead with those purchases. But as you said, if you look at government as a major player, the government will not immediately come back, to the table, except if they feel that that's the way that they can support this specific sector, and then start buying that. But once again, it is an item it's a luxury item. It's a discretionary type of item. And it's not that we have any government initiatives where, like an election, where you would probably need some of that. I think the other part that we have to consider is the tourism sector, because many of these vehicles are being used as rentals. So if we import vehicles, a large part of that also goes to the tourism sector, for transport of tourists. Now, if you look at the recovery of the tourist sector, the tourism sector, that will probably take a longer time. We're looking probably at 2021, because remember, first of all, people have now their balance sheets have been affected. They are not sure whether they should be traveling to a destination and whether this destination is safe, and whether the destination that they're traveling to, whether those people will accept them, because I also want to know where you come from.
Yes, exactly.
So that's quite telling, and what you will find is that will play into this recovery that you're talking about. I would love to sit here and say to you, look, Jo Marie, that number will pick up with with X amount or X percentage, but very difficult to predict. And as I said, if you look at the drivers of those of the motor vehicle sector, the sales itself, it's government, it's the tourist sector, which is the business, and then if you look at your consumer, because remember, you and I, we are in uncertain times.
Absolutely.
I don't know whether I'll have work in the next 6 months, so I will not use my money for that. I'd rather save my money and make sure that I spend it on something that's probably worthwhile. Yeah.
Very bad news for the industry selling new vehicles. On the other hand, there seem to be a possibility of an impetus for the second-hand car industry. Any thoughts on that?
We've tried for the last number of years to see whether we can get good information or good data from the second-hand vehicle market. Very difficult to get that. Anecdotally, we know that you would normally, because of the imports that have now made their appearance in Namibia, many people will go for the imported car, because that's cheaper than a new car. So definitely there has been a move from new vehicles to that specific segment of the market, and I would think there would probably be a pickup. But once again, the overriding factor here is, can I afford it? Will I be able to afford it in the next, let's say after 6 months or after a year? Because as an individual, I need to take my own situation in consideration. So in economics, what we talk about is the reasonable, or the reasonable man.
Yes.
Yeah. So will you make a reasonable decision or not? And I think the decision will probably be to stop with the luxury items, to stop with those discretionary items. Let's not go there, because it's expensive, and if I don't buy it in cash, I'll probably have to access credit. And what we've seen in some of the credit numbers, the money in banking numbers, is that your unsecured lending is actually still elevated.
Yes.
And that is a worrying factor, because it seems people are financing some of their normal spending
Precisely.
out of that unsecured.
Yes,
unsecured
and in all probability, those numbers, I'm very keen to see the numbers for April, to see to which extent,
Yes.
Especially the consumer and business, because they had to pay salaries, etc.,
Correct.
have accessed that short-term instruments at banks. Also, when it comes to banks and financing, for instance, a new vehicle, etc. Given the pressure they are under to grant payment holidays and all sorts of relief and act as a massive stimulus, they will probably also have a bit of a stricter eye when it comes to granting loans for the liquidity in the sector.
That's right, yeah, that's right. So despite the fact that you will get assistance from the bank, the banker will look at it and say, Joe Marie, can you afford to buy this? Do you have access to other funds, for instance? And so you will probably find that stricter and stricter measures, and that means excluding more and more people from accessing financing at the bank. And that's just, it is just part of this whole process, because the bank also has to be prudent.
Of course.
You can't just left, right, and center accept people to and approve people to for financing.
Very interesting times we're living in. Bruce, thank you very much for your thoughts. We will certainly touch base again.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
That was our show for this week. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Stay safe.